Good evening. I'm Mike Perry, Executive Director of the Army Heritage Center Foundation. Tonight, we're pleased to host Colonel Scott Lingamfelter, who was raised in Richmond, Virginia, and attended VMI, where he received a Bachelor of Arts in History. After graduating as a distinguished military graduate, he was commissioned in the regular Army as a field artilleryman and eventually as a Middle East Foreign Area Officer. Scott had a variety of assignments across the globe, including Germany, South Korea, and multiple assignments into the Middle East. Following a service in the field, he served in the Defense Intelligence Agency as a political military officer, in the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency for the Department of State, and as a senior advisor on the Special Access Program for the Army's senior leadership. Ultimately, he served as a military assistant to the Director, Operations Test and Evaluation of the Office of Secretary of Defense. He is a graduate of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, the U.S. Army Joint Forces Staff College, and the U.S. Army War College. He retired in 2001 after 28 years of active service. Scott also has significant experience in the Middle East as a U.S. Army military observer with the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization, working both Observer Group Syria and Observer Group Lebanon in the midst of the armed turmoil back in the 1980s. He has witnessed the Middle East not only as a military observer, but also as a combat artilleryman with the 1st Infantry Division during Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. In that war, he served as an executive officer in the Division Artillery and helped plan and execute the largest field artillery assault on enemy forces since World War II. Among his numerous awards, and he has many, I'll highlight what I think are the most important, are the Defense Superior Service Medal, 2 Legions of Merit, and the Bronze Star. After retiring from the military, he worked for private sector, focusing on strategic planning and support of senior leaders for the U.S. Army, U.S. Missile Defense Agency in Washington, D.C. Additionally, he worked emergency management, homeland security, and border security in support of federal agencies, states, and localities. He also served as an elected official, serving in the Virginia House of Delegates from 2002 to 2018, where he represented Prince William and Farquhar counties. Since retiring from the General Assembly, he has become an author. And tonight we're here to talk about his first book, Desert Redleg: Artillery Warfare in the First Gulf War. Scott will take questions at the end of his talk. Scott, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Mike. I hope you can hear me okay now and everything is up and running. You have to check these things on the front end. I just want to start off by thanking all of you who are listening in tonight for taking the time to come and listen to me speak about this, what I believe to be a very, very important war, particularly in terms of the lessons learned that we've derived from Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, the first Gulf War, as I call it, and what the implications are for our Army going forward in terms of what did we learn in the first Gulf War, and is that applicable to us today? And I would suggest to you that it is. First, I want to thank you, Mike, and the Army Heritage Center for inviting me to make this presentation. I'm quite honored to be included with those who have gone before me. I'm also very grateful to Joe Craig and the Association of the U.S. Army for including me in their book program, and for all the help and the encouragement and efforts they made in helping publish Desert Redleg by the University Press of Kentucky. So without further ado, why don't we project our first slide, and I'll just let you know, Mike, when to flip slides, if that's okay. All right, so first slide, please. I want to share a little bit about my background. Mike's done this in this introduction, but you can sort of take a peek at what my background has been. I have been very fortunate to have had 2 interesting and engaging careers, particularly as a soldier and artilleryman and a Middle East specialist. However, while being a writer is very rewarding, and it is, being a grandfather is even better. And I'm getting ready, my wife and I are getting ready to have our not us personally, but we're getting ready to experience our 5th grandchild. So we're very excited about that. Next slide. A little bit about on my primary sources. I kept a diary, and my boss, Lieutenant General retired Mike Dodson, did as well. And he provided his journal to me. And I was very glad, by the way, that they lined up very nicely. I also had my original battle map, the 1st Infantry Division's operational graphics, copies of operational orders, fire plans, and so forth, that were very useful in developing a timeline and validating events and places that I cite in the book and so forth. Most helpful were the after-action reviews that were developed by my subordinates in the 1st Infantry Division Artillery, the DeVarty, who had been placed under my authority by then Colonel Dodson. And in particular, I would mention the headquarters and headquarters battery commander, Captain Merv Heimel, the Bravo 6 Field Artillery MLRS commander, Captain Rick Nichols, the target acquisition battery commander, Captain Larry Seafeld, and the 12th Chemical Commander. The 12th Chemical Company was also seconded to my organization, Captain Phil Visser. They were dynamite officers. Next slide, please. So why this book? First, this war was the first major conflict after Vietnam, and it's pretty much received footnote status in large measure because it unfolded so quickly. It was a decisive win and didn't have the controversy associated with it that we've seen in other conflicts. And I think you might also take note, and I did, sadly, here we are at the 30th anniversary of the first Gulf War, and nary a mention of it, hardly at all, by the national news media last month when we came upon our 30th anniversary, in February, actually. Second, this was the right war for the right reason, because it addressed unambiguous aggression. It was also a real test of the doctrine developed to address a Soviet threat, but actually employed against a Soviet-equipped surrogate in Iraq. Third, I wanted to document the role of the field artillery in this war, because nowhere else had that story been fully told, when in fact it was decisive during 8 days of raids and firing a huge artillery preparation in support of the 1st Infantry Division's breach operation against enemy defensive positions. Next slide, please. So who are the major characters in the book? First of all, and you can read them right there in front of you, but Tom Rame, who was our division commander, was just a superb division commander. I'll have more to say about them at the end of the presentation, but I've included their retired ranks here also. All of them were quite successful. Next slide, please. Here are the major events that the book addresses. As you can see, this was not a slow-moving timeline. It was actually 8 months of high tempo, packed with things that had to happen, and in fact did happen. Next slide, please. I'm going to show you 2 slides. One, this is the sort of Desert Storm footprint. This map reveals the space within which we operated in a very volatile area of the Middle East. As you can see, it's sitting there next to the Persian Gulf, astride the border between Iran and Iraq. For several years, Iran and Iraq had been at war with one another in this area. And so this area had seen quite a bit of combat, particularly in the northern area of that box. Next slide, please. This shows the vast movement we made from the port of Dammam to positions in the desert where we would execute the huge left hook that General Norman Schwarzkopf devised to deceive and then destroy Iraqi forces and drive them from Kuwait. Next slide, please. No presentation of a conflict would be complete without a reference to a mission and the organization that executed that mission. So here are both the division and the DeVarty's respective missions. Simply put, the Big Red One, the top statement, was tasked to open a huge breach for the 7th Corps to attack through, while the DeVarty had the mission of supporting that key objective as seen in the lower statement. It would take a huge effort, as I share in the book. Next slide, please. The next series of slides shows how the war played out according to the phases that I use to tell this story. Now, these aren't actual phases that you would have found in our operations order, but I've taken this approach to make it a little easier on the reader as they go through the process. Next slide. This shows our initial 465-kilometer movement from the port of Dammam to the tactical assembly area we initially occupied, named after Teddy Roosevelt, who was a 1st Infantry Division veteran during the First World War. This location was designed to deceive the enemy as to the direction we would take in the attack. It's hard to see on this slide, but the sort of diagonal line running from Kuwait from the northeast to the southwest was the Wadi Abatin, which was a depression area through which water flowed when there was heavy rain. And the Iraqis, I think, expected that we would come up that wadi since it points nicely into Kuwait. And we likewise expected them to possibly use that. So we set up near it, hoping that they would be fooled into thinking we were going to use that wadi when in fact we had no such intention. Next slide, please. This portrays the 160-kilometer initial jump forward from TAA Roosevelt to our pre-attack positions opposite the Iraqi 26th Infantry Division, where we conducted our artillery raids. Next slide. Then we moved forward into the breach area to conduct our attack on the 24th and the 25th of February, where we fired a huge preparation in support of the division assault. This is where, by the way, we spent a great deal of time, 8 days, continuous days, of firing artillery raids on the 26th Infantry Division. Next slide. After the breach, the 1st Infantry Division attacked an additional 115 kilometers deeper into Iraq to take on the Iraqi Republican Guards situated on objective Norfolk. Next slide. We then attacked 80 kilometers into Kuwait to complete the liberation mission. This was an extremely challenging phase because the terrain we had to cover was just terrible. Next slide, please. We were then ordered to advance 35 kilometers north to clear Safwan airfield in Iraq of a remaining Iraqi tank brigade and establish the peace talk sites there. This was an interesting engagement that Colonel Greg Fontenot addresses in his book about the 1st Infantry Division. And this is also where I share my perspective on that same engagement. Next slide, please. We then traveled 150 kilometers back into Iraq to occupy positions to await Saddam's capitulation or to be prepared to resume the attack if that was warranted. Next slide, please. Finally, we made a 2-day, 150-kilometer movement back into Saudi Arabia. In sum, these movements from January to April of 1991 amounted to 1,195 kilometers. Quite a march, all of which I describe in the book. Next slide. I won't cover this in any detail now, but I do in the book. But I want you to understand the tremendous contribution that was made by the artillery to support the Big Red One, and this slide shows it. The roll-up at the bottom says it all. In red, within the 5 brigade-sized artillery organizations, 2 from U.S. forces in Europe, 2 from the U.S., 1 from Great Britain, there were a total of 17 battalions of artillery supporting the 1st Infantry Division. This was a major decision by the 7th Corps to support the 1st Infantry Division's breach of Iraqi defensive positions. It was also an unprecedented assembly of artillery that we have not seen since World War II in any operation. And Colonel Mike Dotson and the DuVardy team had the mission to make all of this come together effectively. Next slide. Here are some of the pictures in the book of our units firing missions, including 155 millimeter howitzers and the multiple launch rocket system, or MLRS. They were all extremely busy. Next slide. So the artillery raids. I would draw your attention to some of the key points on this slide. The 8 days of raids were a combined arms operation with force protection provided by our maneuver units to the artillery that would actually execute these raids. For Dodson, the raids had several important purposes. First was to destroy the enemy. You would expect that. Second, to test the enemy's responses. You would expect that. Third, to practice counterfire if the enemy had sent any toward us in our positions. And fourth, to train our units, our 17 battalions and those 5 brigade-size organizations in tactical movement and fire control, while giving our soldiers the experience of firing in combat conditions to test our mettle. Just as a footnote, it's very, very important that commanders seize the opportunity, even during combat, to do additional training. You just can't get enough of it. Dodson gave each one of these headquarters, shown earlier, an opportunity to lead one of these raids so they could experience their own command and control and exercise their own command and control within their systems. But our primary effort was directed at destroying the Iraqis' ability to use its artillery on us, while preparing the way for the 1st Infantry Division to open a huge breach to allow the other 7th Corps divisions to continue the attack deeper into Iraq. Next slide. Here are the raid results, and without a doubt, the force artillery did their work in destroying much of the enemy's capability, as I described later in the book. Almost nothing has been written about this, about any of it. And it is vitally important that the Army today take note of what worked in the past and will be needed again in the future on future battlefields, namely overwhelming artillery firepower and massed fires to shock and destroy our enemies. Next slide. As a matter of interest, we fired a huge amount of ammunition during both the raids and the preparation. The difference, however, from past wars was the intelligence we had in this one to accurately target the enemy and make the best use of our ammunition. In the raids, we fired 9,208 rounds over 8 days, and in the same time frame, we fired 1,606 rockets. And to give you a feel for what that means, each of those rockets contained 644 individual dual-purpose submunitions. The Iraqis actually nicknamed the MLRS system Steel Rain, and for good reason. And after firing a 30-minute preparation with an additional 6,136 rounds and 414 rockets prior to the division's breach, the destruction of the enemy was nearly complete. Next slide. On this slide, you will see the results of the divisions and the Divardi's efforts. Tom Raim's quote at the top of the page, just moments before the preparation commenced on the 24th of February, pretty much says it all. The red below is a snapshot of what we accomplished when combined arms and synchronized combat power was brought to bear on the enemy. This is a lesson that today's Army must sustain. Of note, fully 25% of all the 155 rounds fired in the CENTCOM theater were fired by the Big Red 1 Divardi's 3 direct support artillery battalions. Great show on their part. Next slide, please. As they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Note the POWs in the center of the picture. Interestingly, our Divardi Tactical Operations Center wound up processing 400 plus of these guys in the course of the operation. So that really took us off our game for a while until we got them processed and headed toward the rear. Next slide, please. So the ceasefire was called on the morning of February 28th, and our assistant S3, Major Tom Conran, and I were glad to shed our chemical protective gear on a knoll west of our new position in Kuwait. And no doubt, don't be fooled, I don't have a helicopter growing out of the top of my head, but it is one of my favorite pictures. Here I smoked a fine cigar, celebration cigar that my brother-in-law sent me from Richmond, Virginia. Fortunately, that logistical system worked very well. Next slide. Our challenges. We had many challenges during this war, but I would just highlight a few here. They range from escaping the port to logistics, ammunition and fuel supply, understanding which artillery units would actually support the division artillery. And sometimes that was hard to get to because the early planning when we were back in TAA Roosevelt didn't firm up as to what artillery units we could truly expect to have. But if you're going to do the fire planning, if you're going to do the logistics and put the ammunition on the ground that you need, you really have to get an answer to that question as soon as you can. Chief among our challenges was the control of a huge number, 17 battalions, as I noted, of artillery that was just unprecedented for a DIVARTY to orchestrate in modern combat. And I would just say as a footnote, I was a DIVARTY S3, I was a DIVARTY XO, I was a battalion commander during my career. And I have to tell you, before this war, I had no experience at all where a DIVARTY, even in a training situation, would control much more than about 5 battalions. And we were there with 17, and Mike Dotson did a fantastic job. I'm not sure anybody could have done it better, if you want to know the truth. I would highlight logistics as a major challenge, but the efforts of our chief logistician in the Big Red One, Colonel Bob Shadley, who went on to be a general, was absolutely superb. Lieutenant General Gus Pagonis, if you recall, was the CENTCOM logistician, and he got a lot of supplies into theater. But the infrastructure and the systems we had were simply insufficient to move these supplies effectively to the field for distribution. So we had some real lessons to learn there, particularly in that area where doctrine did not line up well with desert warfare, because that doctrine was perfected on the European continent or in Asia. It really wasn't designed well for the desert. Next slide. Here are some of the key lessons we learned. The annual Reforger exercises prepared us. That's the return of forces to Germany exercise, where stateside units would load up and prepare to go over and deploy to Europe to back up European-based U.S. Army units. The Reforger exercises prepared us well to get into the theater of operations in the Middle East, but we were unprepared to deal with the confusion of the port. And as I've noted, the logistical infrastructure there was very thin, making resupply a daily headache. Command and control of a large force artillery is very difficult, but Dotson and his team did a remarkable job at it. This highlights the essentiality, by the way, of the DIVARTY commander to do this very important mission, and Dotson, frankly, was the best I ever saw. Mobility of the artillery is essential. The good news is the Army today is addressing this. Fratricide is an ever-present threat, and unexploded ordnance was a problem for us in the desert. We expected 5%. We experienced 23%. Artillery survivability positions and ammunition holding areas required engineering support, but there simply wasn't enough to go around. And going home, we learned that you need an effective port support activity, a unit drawn from within the division to get the equipment home. But we managed to do this well, as I describe in the book. Next slide. Then Major General Rame chose me to command the port support activity, and my transportation movements planner was Captain Renee Miller, in the center, and she was absolutely superb. My senior NCO on the right, Sergeant First Class Doug Evans, nicknamed her the Hammer, because if she was a real taskmaster when it came to getting ships loaded. Everyone learned fast not to get in the way of that hammer, all 5'5" of her. Next slide. Did we get the job done at the tactical level? So what tactical lessons did we learn from the first Gulf War? Clearly, the air-land battle doctrine that was developed by Vietnam veterans in the 70s worked. That was a real testament to how they sought to improve the Army after the Vietnam War. The well-vetted logistics doctrine, as I noted, that we used in Europe and Asia was not easily adaptable to the desert that just lacked the infrastructure, the roads, the rail, the warehousing just wasn't there. The war also highlighted the need for the Divarti to have a peacetime training relationship as they may be tasked to fight together in the future. And that relationship I speak of is between the field artillery brigades and the division artilleries. We need to do a better job of that going forward. Joint operations among the services was completely validated, particularly between the Army and the Air Force in close air support. The Army was at a high point, frankly speaking, in 1990 in terms of training and readiness, and that showed up on the battlefield. But there were holes in the deploying and redeploying, and I suspect that much of that has actually been addressed 3 decades later. I sure hope so. Next slide. So, now turning to strategic lessons. President Bush's assembly of a 35-nation coalition was frankly brilliant, and he kept it together, even as Israel was tempted to get involved when attacked by Scud missiles, Iraqi Scud missiles. He provided great flexibility, the president did, to commanders on the ground to get the job done and allowed them to do sound planning with permissive rules of engagement, ROE, and excellent operational security. The U.S. dominance in military power was also a huge message to the world. We must never lose that capability or posture, particularly in the eyes of our chief competitors, but also those who would engage us in aggression that impacts our vital national interests. Next slide. Finally, I take a critical look at the geopolitics, the geopolitical results, if you will, and ask several questions here about that. Did we achieve the family of nations concept and the new world order imagined by President Bush? Would we have fought a subsequent war in Iraq? Had we eliminated Saddam Hussein once and for all right then? Were we agile in adapting to the conditions that emerged, conditions that may have presented themselves for exploitation? I discuss all of this in the final chapter, but please, no cheating, don't read ahead. The bottom line is, I do think we missed an opportunity here, but that is an assessment each and every one of us must decide based on the facts as we see them. I report, you decide. Next slide. Here's some personal reflections. Now, finally, some comments about the key players in this book. First, many of us never thought this was a war we would fight. And it speaks loudly to war planners today that you must be ready for any contingency. Tom Rain was a superb division commander and was always thinking ahead. For him, there truly was no mission too difficult. Mike Dotson was the most competent and professional soldier I ever served with. I doubt this could have been so successful without him. Our S3, Ed Cardenas, was the most unflappable and focused soldier among us. We are dear friends to this day. And even there in Carlisle, Ed and I attended the War College together. And we we would trade stories about this war, many of which I was able to resurrect in the text. And my driver, Roger Lee McGarry, pictured as a soldier. He's pictured there on the right in front of a cannon that we acquired from the Iraqis. He was a soldier through and through. He was always there at my side to get things done, and I am eternally grateful to him. He is a fine man even to this day, and I've stayed in touch with him. The direct support battalion commanders, Lieutenant Colonels Harry Emerson, John Gingrich, and Lanny Smith, the DeVarty staff, the NCOs, the soldiers of the DeVarty were the very best. All of them lived up to the division's motto, no mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great, duty first. Next slide. Well, this is my advertisement for the field artillery. And I think this about says it all. You need a strong artillery in the future. These were the Redlegs of the past. Next slide. And here are the Desert Redlegs that did so much to write this book. Next slide. This is the quote from the book's introduction, and it should tell you what I think of the big red one. Even now, it is too hard for me to read to you, so you can read it to yourself. Next slide. So, Mike, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to the Army Heritage Center and your guests tonight, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Right now we have 3 up there. First is from Christian. He wanted to know, did you receive an effective counter battery fire at all?
Not that we expected. Most of the firing that, well, to back up, we really laid the hammer on these artillery units from day one. As soon as we got into a position where we could take them under fire, we did. And we pounded them every single day, day and night, with these raids that we conducted. We had, quite frankly, very good intelligence. And so we knew where they were. And what Mike Dotson wanted to do very, very early in the process was to take them down, because he knew it would be difficult for the Iraqis to surge more artillery forward since they were spread out over hell's half acre. And so it was extremely difficult for them to bring in more. So we looked at all the artillery in depth, not only the 26th Infantry Division, but the 50th Armored Division and other units that were sitting behind the 26th Infantry. And we focused very systematically on taking down their big shooters, the ones that we knew would be the #1 threat to our maneuver forces going through the breach. That was job one. And credits to the Air Force. They were there too. And we used their fires additively and with our fires as we poured it on the enemy. So they learned very early that if they did shoot, it would be a matter of minutes before they would get a huge steel hammer dropped on their head. They did fire elimination rounds at night, but generally speaking, we did not experience the counterfire that we had trained for in the European theater.
The next question comes from Joe, but I may have to ask for an interpretation of an acronym. How did you properly manage expectation of capabilities with the maneuver commanders via, it says EFST, which I'm not sure what that is.
The ESFT.
EFST.
You have to remind me.
I don't know either. So, Joe, if you want to type in later on what that is, it would be helpful. But how did you manage the expectations of capabilities with maneuver commanders?
Well, the first thing in managing their expectations is to meet their expectations on their mission. The role of the field artillery is to support the maneuver arms. And so you have to have a very close working relationship. The direct support battalion commanders we had, Emerson, Gingrich, Lanny Smith, were superb. They were always in touch with their brigade maneuver commanders. They knew what the brigade commanders wanted to accomplish. from a maneuver standpoint, and they worked very effectively with them. And they were trained to do that. You know, the beauty of the field artillery, and I say this to young field artillerymen when I have a chance to speak with them, the most important thing a young field artilleryman can do, aside from being tactically and technically strong in fire support, both the gunnery solution and the fire planning solution, but also to understand maneuver tactics. You cannot, by definition, be an effective field artilleryman if you do not understand how the maneuver guys fight their fight. You just can't do it. When the maneuver commander turns to his direct support battalion commander and says, we are going into the deliberate defense, or we're going into a deliberate offensive operation, or we're going to do an envelopment, or a river crossing, or a breach operation, or a pursuit, or an exploitation, that artilleryman has to know the immediate implications that maneuver mission has for how he will apply a scheme of fires to assist that brigade commander. So I don't know if I've gotten to it or not, but that's sort of what I heard in the background of this question. I think
so they need to clarify what that concept is. We may have called it something different, but nowadays I think they call it essential fire support tasks. But I think
I think we called it, Mike, blowing stuff up.
Or metal. We called it metal, METL.
Right.
So
the scheme of fires, the fire support plan.
This one comes from Brian, who was an FDC chief 3 years after Vietnam and ETS 3 years before the Gulf War. He wants to know, basically your fire control systems, were you using TAC fire and BCS systems, or had they been replaced for you prior to the Gulf War?
We were using a TAC fire system at the brigade and battalion levels. And as you know, if you worked with TAC fire, it was an early generation computer system, and you had to put it on 5-ton trucks to carry it around with you. So it was pretty bulky. But if it was working right, and you had well-trained fire direction NCOs and fire direction enlisted men working the system, and fire direction officers who understood the power of TAC fire, it was quite good, particularly in pushing what I would call the tactical and the technical fire support solutions digitally down from the brigades to the battalions. As far as the calculations at the battalion level, I think that was pretty much the BCS system that we had at the time. In the MLRS, it was a FCS system, I think we called it. But essentially, a smaller computer designed to move technical data, deflection and quadrant, time, and so forth, to the guns. And that worked fairly well. So I think one of the success stories is, after several years in the field artillery struggling, and we did, believe me, in the 1980s, we struggled with computerized fire support, both the tactical and technical solutions for fire support. We struggled with the systems to make those work. It came together, and it came together nicely on the Desert Force. So that was good news. Fortunately, the field artillery in the Army has made a major investment in digital communications and transmitting digital data. And I mean, I think now some of that solution is actually taking place on the gun itself. Yes, maybe I answered your question.
This is from David. I'm going to slightly interpret the question. He said, since you served at the tail end of the Vietnam War and all the way through the Gulf War, what things did you do as an artilleryman, as a young lieutenant captain, that were lessons in Vietnam that changed over the course of your career prior to going out to Desert Shield, Desert Storm?
That's a great question. I started off as a fire direction officer in an XO in an 8-inch battery in Germany. And so my life as an XO was a busy thing. You know, I would show up in the position, my chief of firing battery would lay the battery. I would run over to the FDC, get the FDC quickly set up with my NCOs and my enlisted folks. I would sit down under a nearby tree with a hand-generated MET plus VE. That was where we used to take the muzzle velocities that we had recorded for each of our guns and apply the current meteorological data to those things and work up a correction, if you will, so that when we shot from our initial position that we had just occupied, our rounds were more accurate than if we just rolled up and hadn't done any of that, and then we'd have to do more ground adjustments. So I guess my early lessons that carried through was there's really no substitute in my mind for training a young artilleryman to understand what we call fall of shot, to understand what is going on in that gunnery solution. And as we've moved into this sort of technical, digital, computer-generated solution world, I fear that some of that understanding, both internal and external ballistics, if you will, is not quite as crisp as maybe it should be. But I hope I can be persuaded when I go out to Fort Sill and visit them, hopefully in the next couple of years, that that's really not a problem, that in fact we are training that well. But the one thing that I learned was that for me, I learned as a fire planner that the more I recalled from my early years as a lieutenant, the better I was able to do my job. I hope that makes some sense.
This is another question from another Joe, who is probably not part of 7th Corps, because he wanted to know, how did the initial air assaults, perhaps of the 101st, play in your success?
Well, that was pretty remote from us. Those air assaults took place. I mentioned the left hook that we did from the Big Red One when we made our breach operation, and the 7th Corps divisions went off our left and right shoulder after we made that breach and attacked deeper. They sort of fanned out. But further west, even more, the 18th Airborne Corps with the 101st, the 82nd, and the 24th Infantry were doing their own deep, wild sweep into Iraq towards the, I believe, towards the Euphrates River area. So I didn't have a lot of visibility on that. What I know is pretty much what you know from reading some of the big text of that, Schwarzkopf's book and others, the detail what everybody did. My book is focused pretty much on the 1st Infantry Division, the artillery, and the 7th Corps. So I don't have a lot of detail about that. I have talked to people who participated in that. I was a good friend of General Benny P. He and I had a great relationship after we both retired from the Army. He went on to be the superintendent of VMI when I was in the Virginia General Assembly, and we would talk about what their experience was. And I got to tell you, when you're talking air assault and helicopters in the desert, the sand does a number on the turbines of these aircraft. And that's something I think that caught a lot of people by surprise. There was a whole lot of maintenance that had to take place on these aircraft when we got back to the United States.
This question is from James. Please discuss the airspace deconfliction measures between the Army and the U.S. Air Force.
Well, now, this is an interesting story. By the time that we were engaged in close air support with the Air Force, the Air Force had gained air superiority. They had basically wiped out the Iraqi Air Force. And so it was a rather interesting deal, particularly with the close air, the A-10s. That was just fascinating. I mean, the A-10s would come out and sort of, bore a hole in the air, camp out and look for targets. And they talk directly to us, and we talk to them and vector them out on targets that we were looking for. In fact, there was one time and I don't want to give it away, but I'll just share with you since you asked the question. In the book, I discuss the development of a hasty ACA, an air coordinating measure, where we had an A-10 working about the time that the Brits were about to fire, Mike, a major target set. And someone realized, holy smokes, there's an A-10 sitting in front of these guys. And so the British liaison officer, now Major Rick Radis, he retired as a major, jumped on the net with our DeVarty TOC and quickly put together a hasty ACA and got the A-10 out of the way just as the rounds came in and impacted on the target, and the A-10 was able to report on the BDA straight away. So that's a little artificial. You're not going to see that I believe, in future combat, unless, once again, we're able to knock out all of the enemy's air defense and that would allow an A-10 to sort of park out there. But we did a pretty good job working with the Air Force, and they with us, staying out of the way, not knocking them out of the sky. But at the same time, frankly speaking, we had air superiority, so we had that luxury. But I think it worked well. One area that I think Mike Dodson would tell you that we struggled with was fire support coordination measures. And we found that at the core and above level, they're not well understood. At least they weren't. They were understood fairly well at brigade and below, but the implementation of the fire support coordination measures was a challenge because not everyone's knowledge was where it should have been to do that right. So it's a very good question. Very good one. Maybe you should write a book about it.
When we first talked, Scott, we discussed the 1st Infantry Division's mission was basically to breach, and there was an expectation in that breaching operation they would be pretty much beat up. But yet, throughout the campaign, you found yourselves conducting much more extensive maneuvers. How did you coordinate the transition of artillery battalions forward to maintain continuity of support for the ground forces?
Well, the standard tactical missions are very, very important in this regard. The direct support, reinforcing, general support, reinforcing, and general support missions. And with each mission change, you are able to patch together the artillery support picture by the appropriate assigning of a tactical mission to do that. Now, that's one aspect of it, getting the missions right so that the maneuver commander knows he has a direct support unit working for him, that there's a reinforcing unit with them. When we made our big leap forward from the breach area to objective Norfolk, we found that given the fact that the artillery was fairly slow moving in those days, we have a better platform now, but the M109 just could not keep up with the M1 tanks and the M2 Bradleys. And so it was very important that you took advantage of where the artillery was set on the field. Here's a perfect example. As we made our way forward to assume the battle from the 2nd ACR, the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment that was engaged with the Iraqi Republican Guards there on objective Norfolk, the 2nd ACR had the 210th Field Artillery Brigade acting as its, quote, DeVarty. And so they had artillery battalions on the ground supporting them. When General Creighton Abrams, who was the Corps Artillery Commander, knew that the 1st Division was now going to be ordered to jump forward and do a forward passage of lines through that 2nd ACR to assume the fight on objective Norfolk, he ordered the 210th FA Brigade to be in a reinforcing role to the 1st Infantry DeVarty as we move forward. And so what Mike Dodson was able to do is coordinate with the 210th and tell them, you control the fight until we get there. And as we pass through, we'll pick up the fight from you, which again highlights the importance of these brigade size artillery units being able to do these battle handoff missions between artillery sets. So that was very helpful. The second thing is we had to divide our talks up. We had to divide up our tactical operations center and leapfrog forward, because again, they were 5-ton trucks, they were track vehicles, they just couldn't keep up with M1. So if you didn't leapfrog forward, you would lose contact with your supported maneuver operations. So lots of innovation took place, but the standard tactical mission was the way we prepared ourselves to take these things on, and then using the resourcefulness of the artillery that was in the area to ensure that the mission, there was no break in action, if you will, in support of the maneuver guys.
What about interoperability with you and the Brits as far as capabilities?
Good news story. I mean, the Brits trained on the Stanag. They understood how NATO fought. You know, they were in that North German plain. In fact, when I was in the 5th Corps Artillery, we fairly routinely would train with the Brits, and they knew their stuff. The Bundeswehr, the German artillery guys, knew their stuff, and so NATO and the training that we got in NATO really showed up in Desert Storm, particularly between the Brits and the U.S. guys. I don't know how that worked out with the Marine Corps and the French forces out on the eastern end of the theater, but I suspect that they had a pretty good lace up as well.
This is sort of looking towards the future. When you look at Desert Shield, Desert Storm, a lot of the combat assets, especially 7th Corps, deployed from Germany to the region.
Right.
Europe does not have that capability now. Could we pull something like this off today on the same timeline, or would the timeline have to change?
It would be hard. I happen to be a supporter of a forward deployed force, and I think that you pay a real price when you start pulling forward deployed forces out of Europe or wherever. Look, the United States is a great power. We have great responsibilities. And remember, the enemy always gets a vote. They get to decide what they're going to do. And if we have determined in our national strategy, and the Secretary of Defense, by the way, is my War College classmate and a very capable man. But as we look at the future, and as we look at warfare, you need to understand that it takes a while to get there, even today in 2021. And having forward deployed forces arrayed wisely in the world, I think is just smart military preparedness. And so that's certainly my view of it. And I do think that to your earlier question, Mike, about how the Brits and the US work together, those forward deployed forces are where that took place. It didn't take place sitting at Fort Riley or Fort Gordon, Georgia, or Fort Hood, Texas. It took place on the ground in Germany or on the ground in Korea. That's where you get that mutual support and that relationship for how operations are going to come off.
The other thing we talked about as you look forward, what things concern you about the field artillery's capabilities of providing fire support on future battlefields?
Well, that's a book waiting to be written, Mike. I think you know that. That's why you probably asked it. Let's give kudos to the Army. Under the last administration, there was a major push that I really hope and pray is sustained by the current administration on upgunning the field artillery. You know, for a period of time in the 2000s, unbelievably, the Army did away with its DIVARTIs until somebody awakened to the fact that you really need them in order to do the kind of synchronization that divisions do. And I still believe that the division is the key echelon for the synchronization of combat power and below. And the DIVARTI is an indispensable piece of that, not only in supporting the division commander's scheme of maneuver, but also in training the artillery units in the division artillery. And the system we came up with all this OPCON stuff and brigade level operations, I don't think was the wisest move when it comes to the field artillery. So I think going forward, we've got to get that right. We've got to get this relationship back where it needs to be in order to ensure the artillery is postured and trained to do what it needs to do in support of maneuver commanders. To the Army's credit, however, they have invested a lot of interest in not only range improvements, but improvements in lethality as well. I mean, some of the things that are coming out in terms of the improvement of weapon systems is unbelievable, particularly in terms of range and lethality. That said, at the end of the day, if you're a young platoon leader or you're a company commander or you're a battalion commander and you're decisively engaged with the enemy right there, then you need the capability for the artillery to mass fires in a very destructive and accurate manner to destroy the will of the enemy to resist. And so you're not going to replace mass fires. You're not going to replace the shock and awe that comes with the king of battle. You need to recognize that going forward, you've got to have that capability. And oh, by the way, what do we do when the GPSs break? How are we going to continue to blow stuff up if we don't know how to do hasty survey? If we don't know the tactical manual fire control system to be able to do what we'll have to do when all the gee whiz technology fails. Now I know I sound like an old washed up colonel. Okay, fine.
We're going to go back to charts and darts.
That's exactly right. And so you need to be thinking about these kinds of things. I'll tell you a story. When I was in the desert, my S4, Barry Brooks, who was a fantastic S4, when we were still at Fort Riley, he went out, you ready for this? He bought a whole bunch of fully gimbaled marine compasses, you know, the ones that you got on your boat that swings around as the boat's rolling and pitching and yawing. And we mounted them on our Humvee dashboards. And while everybody was cursing at their newfangled GPSs because they weren't working, we were doing dead reckoning in the field artillery with our marine compass, our map, our odometers, and our speedometers. And guess what? They worked.
Well, what you need to do is remind those of the more current generation that not all our drivers had night vision goggles. We still looked at the little cat's eyes on the vehicle in front of us if we could see them. The plugger was a almost brand new technology that a lot of folks did not know how to use. We were basically at the infancy of the digital army at that time, and it was a challenge in maneuvering in the dark, in the desert, where everything is flat and you have no terrain features.
Last time I checked, Mike, I do not recall us retiring the bayonet quite yet.
No, not yet. So in closing, any final thoughts for the evening?
Well, you can have the best technology in the world. You can have the best doctrine in the world. You can have the best training in the world. But the one thing that we have is the American GI. He or she never fails us. And we need to keep our eye on the ball as an Army or Marine Corps or Navy or any of the services, Air Force, Coast Guard, that we have to recruit people who understand what it takes to succeed in combat. And that needs to be our focus. And then every leader needs to remember that at the end of the day, his or her first priority is the care of that soldier. That's what I would say. I hope that people will buy our book. If you would like an autographed copy, you can go to that website right there, Michael.
Okay.
And you can order a copy. And I got an order in for a whole bunch of them to come into my, let me put it up again, copybookwarrior.com. You can get an autographed copy there. Or if you want to save a few bucks, because I have to mail it to you and it costs a little more to do the autograph thing, you can go to Amazon, you can go to Books A Million, you can go to Goodreads and order it online. Do my publisher a favor, go to University Press of Kentucky and order it from them. I want to keep my publisher happy, but I think you'll enjoy the book, and I think that you'll learn from the book, particularly an area of study that really has not been cataloged. And I spent a lot of time talking about soldiers and NCOs and the young officers that made all this come together. They were great, and man, I love them to pieces.
Well, we want to thank you for joining us tonight. We also have the book for sale in our museum store here at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. Want to also thank AUSA for making the introduction because it was Craig Joseph up at the AUSA that introduced us and got us moving in the direction of having you speak tonight. For those in attendance, please let your friends know that this lecture will be posted up on our YouTube site here in the next couple days. And you can encourage them. We'll let you know when that happens. We'll send a notice out to you. And please pass it to others because it's important for our Army that our field artillerymen, and I'm an infantry guy, is strong and powerful as we look at who we might fight in the future. So again, thank you tonight. Best of luck on the book, and we'll talk about the next book when you get a chance.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you. Good night.
Good night.